My next guest has long been an advocate for school choice and parental rights when it comes to their children's education. She served as U.S. Secretary of Education under President Donald Trump and is the author of the new book, Hostages No More: The Fight for Education Freedom and the Future of the American Child. Please welcome to the program BETSY DeVOS. Secretary DeVos, thank you for being here. I want to get to your important book in a moment, but first I need to get your reaction to a couple of these Supreme Court decisions that really impact schools and education in an important way, starting with that Carson versus Macon decision in Maine. This touched on school choice. The court ruled 6-3 that Maine's tuition assistance program, one of the oldest school choice programs in the country, could not discriminate against families who wish to send their kids to faith-based school. Betsy, why is this ruling so important, and how could it affect school choice going forward?
Well, it's a really important ruling in that it continues to take the step toward totally abolishing the Blaine amendments, which, as you well know, Raymond, were very bigoted against children going to Catholic schools. And what it basically says is that you cannot hold religious animus against any educational opportunity. And in the case of Maine, where parents were making the decision where to send their children, it does not constitute a state interest. In other words, the imaginary wall separation between church and state remains intact because families are making that decision. So again, it's a very important ruling that continues to undergird other states' efforts to supply and provide education freedom, school choice opportunities to their families.
Betsy, the dissenting justices said it was not the religious character of the schools that was at issue. It was those schools who used the funds to promote religious ideals. Your reaction?
Well, the reality is, as the majority continued to state in previous cases, is you cannot separate your faith from other parts of your life, and to suggest that separating out your expression of faith from portions of your education is a possibility just doesn't work. And they reaffirmed that this is actually permissible, and not only permissible, but we should certainly encourage and allow for it. And the reality is that in many, many schools today, there is religion being practiced and taught. It's a secular humanism that our students are being subjected to.
Great point. Another big decision handed down was that Kennedy versus Bremerton, the public display of prayer case in which Coach Joseph Kennedy, was a guest on our show, was fired for public prayer on the playing field after his football games. What effect do you think Coach Kennedy's decision, or that ruling rather, has on both prayer as well as public displays of religion on school campuses?
Well, again, I think it affirms the right to express your faith, to acknowledge that your faith is part of life. And in Coach Kennedy's case, it was a voluntary thing that he did. He didn't compel anyone else to join him. He welcomed them if they wanted to. And I think it's a great model for any of us who want to express our faith in ways that we hope will be attractive to others and not off-putting. But it's a reaffirmation of the right that we find in the First Amendment, the right to practice our faith and our religion.
Yeah. Getting back to the issue of school choice, and you've really been on the forefront of this for so many years, Betsy, where does school choice stand now, particularly in the inner city, where public schools are failing really more than ever, and what more needs to be done here? Is anyone in the current administration even interested in school choice?
Well, no, the current administration is doing everything it can to preclude families and parents making those choices for their children, with a tax on charter schools, with a tax on private schools at every turn. And the reality is there is great momentum around actually allowing families the ability to choose where their children go to school, to attach the resources that are, I like to use the metaphor of a backpack with kids going to school with what they need for the day in their backpack. Metaphorically, we need to attach the resources that are already being spent on that child in that backpack to take to a school, whether it's a Catholic school or another private faith-based school or any other school that that family chooses and deems as the right fit for their children. So there's a lot of momentum around this at state levels. We've seen it, especially because of the last 2 years, families having a front row seat at how their children's education was happening. And in many cases, all too many cases, it wasn't happening, with schools in many urban areas that were shut down for almost 2 years, 2 full academic years, and kids who could least afford it being locked out of in-person learning for that period of time. Not to mention all of the front row seat at the kinds of curriculum that their children were being subjected to, many cases antithetical to a family's values. In other cases, realizing that their education was not robust or did not have high expectations for their students. And so families who have been able to had the resources have taken things in their own hands. And we're now seeing policymakers at state levels across the country taking this matter seriously, starting to pass more and more education freedom, school choice programs. Just last week in Arizona, the legislature passed the first universal education savings account program in the country. And that's going to allow all 1.1 million students in Arizona choose a different school if their assigned school doesn't work for them.
Yeah, that's a seismic decision that really got very little attention, but it's so important. I want to move on to Title IX. This is the 50-year-old civil rights law that sought to prohibit sex discrimination in education. Now, the Biden administration has proposed an overhaul of Title IX, including the rules you established as Education Secretary. Now, this touches on how schools should respond to sexual violence on campus. Critics of the administration's rule changes say they destroy due process rights for the accused. Supporters of Biden's rule change says your rules made it easy for the schools to dodge responsibility for sexual violence. What is your response, Secretary DeVos?
Well, very much absolutely the opposite of what is being contended by the Biden administration. Our rule actually set up a fair, balanced framework for both parties in a situation like this to ensure due process rights were protected, and importantly, to ensure that the victim or the survivor or the one doing the accusing had control of the situation, could decide how to proceed in a case of sexual violence or sexual misconduct. It is a very very fair, very straightforward, and predictable framework that schools have been implementing, and doing it with respect for the notion that every individual has to know what they're being accused of and has to have the right to information and to be able to exchange information and ultimately have someone determine which party has the right claim. But the Biden administration is proposing to do away with every single piece of that and basically throw it back into the chaos that the Obama administration had invented with the Dear Colleague letter that they sent out in 2011, which threw the whole process into absolute chaos and resulted in kangaroo court processes for hundreds and hundreds of students.
Yeah, and under those old rules, before you reformed them, if someone was charged, the school could find them guilty with a cursory review, no real investigation. And as you alluded to, they don't even have to notify the accused of what they're accused of. They're simply found guilty. These rules were madness, yet that is what is about to be restored here. So we'll see what happens in the days ahead. But what do you fear will happen to the rights of women in sports should the Biden changes in Title IX be adopted?
Well, this is something that they're trying to paper over the top of, but what they have proposed is
Mhm.
to expand the definition of biological sex to include gender identity and any way you want to identify yourself, essentially saying that trans girls that participate on a women's team, that this is an
Mm.
okay thing and that it should be permitted. Well, you cannot be a supporter of Title IX, equal opportunities for men and women, and then at the same time say it's okay for biological men to compete on women's teams. The two just don't
Mm.
coincide at all. And so this is a really large threat, and they're trying not to talk about it in great detail. But I urge and encourage everyone who listens to your program to weigh into this discussion. This is the public comment period for these proposed rules, and we need to push back hard on what they are proposing to do. I cover how we went about this whole process in great detail in my book, Hostages No More.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I think in addition, it's also a great place to really find out how we can truly fix American K-12 education.
Yeah. I want to talk about that new book, Hostages No More, The Fight for Education Freedom and the Future of the American Child. Well, what made you write and release this book now, Betsy? And what do you mean by hostages?
So I would not have written a book had it not been for the last 2 years and navigating COVID, everyone having to navigate COVID and the pandemic and all of the consequences of that. Parents had a front row seat, families had a front row seat at what was happening with their children's education. And many of them are very unhappy. Many of them were shocked, and many of them have started to find other alternatives. We need to continue to encourage that. The title Hostages No More is provocative, admittedly, but it is a direct reference to the quote made by Horace Mann, who's commonly known as the father of our K-12 education system 175 years ago. He said that educators are entitled to look upon parents as having given hostages to our cause. And parents have seen firsthand how their children have been held hostage to causes other than the sake of primary education for kids.
Yeah, well, in the book you allude to the tipping point really experienced by so many parents in their awareness of how far the decline of the American educational system has gone. And it really is a silver lining in an otherwise very dark cloud.
It is indeed. Even before the pandemic, the achievement levels of kids across the country have continued to decline. Those at the top end of the performance spectrum have plateaued off, and alarmingly, those at the bottom end have actually plummeted by many measures. Also, as compared to our international peers, we are not the top 10 in anything. In fact, we're 13th in reading, 18th in math, or 18th in science, and 37th in math. And that was all before the pandemic. These are figures from before the pandemic. We aren't going to even fully understand or comprehend the tremendously negative impact that all of these shutdowns, these extended shutdowns, have had on kids across the country and vis-a-vis our international peers. It is really devastating. But the flip side is it's a silver lining time for getting policies that will support families and students, not systems and buildings that have for too long had a stranglehold on our kids.
Yeah. In the book, you devote a chapter to what you call the education freedom agenda. And you write, school choice is the power to choose the right school for your child, not just accept the one the government assigns to you. But the term school choice doesn't even capture this moment completely. It makes it sound like we're simply talking about schools, buildings, infrastructure. The movement is really something much bigger than that. What would be your vision for the American educational system if you were able to reconfigure it right now without any government restraints, which you had as Secretary of Education?
Well, I would take all of the funding that is going to education currently, which every year we spend $750 billion a year on K-12 education. I would direct those funds to the families, to the children who are supposed to benefit, who are supposed to be educated, supposed to learn. I would direct those funds to the families to be able to decide and determine where and how their child is going to learn best. And we will quickly see the creativity and the ingenuity of the American people respond and react. We've already started to see it in many ways during COVID, in that families were starting to get together with other families and form what I'd call it, 21st century one-room schoolhouse. We've had a lot of efforts around learning pods, another kind of form of that, learning pods, micro schools. But we have to think more broadly about how kids actually learn and how each of them are very different. And I've used an example of a little school. I live in Michigan. There's a little school in West Michigan I've not yet visited. But as you can imagine, it's very cold in Michigan through the winter months. This school, this particular school, the kids go to school outside all day, all year round. And they're choosing to do that. And the teachers are choosing to be there. But I use it as an example of an entirely different learning environment that's working for these kids. In fact, they have waiting lists of kids wanting to get into this. And so we have to just think much more broadly about what K-12 education can actually be and how kids can actually experience that. And by doing so, prepare themselves to be, contributing, effective, civic-minded adults.
Yeah. I hope they have thick coats, parkas. That makes me cold thinking about it.
I know.
Secretary DeVos, before I let you go, the NEA is meeting this week. They've issued a document arguing for using terms like birthing person and, these gender-neutral pronouns. They're becoming real advocates in that area. And what kind of challenges do we face when you're trying to impart the agenda you're talking about from groups like the NEA?
Well, the NEA and the AFT have been the ringleaders in continuing to hold our children hostage to a very progressive ideology, which has become apparent to many families in the last months or years. And what we should be insisting on, first of all, is that parents have the ability to take their children away from a school that they are disagreeing with and put them in a school they want them in. And secondly, we should be insisting that they should be focused on actually teaching kids subjects that they need to learn, like reading, writing, arithmetic. Let kids be kids. Let them get back to doing what they should as children and as learners. And that is actually learning the things they need to know to be constructive, contributing adults.
Yeah. Secretary DeVos, thank you so much for being here. Hostages No More, The Fight for Education, Freedom, and the Future of the American Child by Betsy DeVos is available now at bookstores everywhere and online. Thank you, Betsy.
Thanks so much, Raymond. Great to be with you.